Bill, thank you for coming to the New Economy Forum. I thought we'd follow up some questions about climate, because it's become a new preoccupation of yours, and then we'll come back to the long-standing issue of China and America at the end. On the climate change, it strikes me that you have become gradually ever more interested in this. You've had the stake in TerraPower and nuclear power, but particularly recently, looking at what you've written and what you've said, it's become a preoccupation. Can you just say what led you to that point?
Yeah, I started spending time on climate about 11 years ago, and had some great professors coming in about 5 times a year educating me on various aspects. 10 years ago I started funding things like TerraPower, and I put several billion into various energy-related things since that time, things like alternative meat, which has gone well, or battery companies that hasn't gone as well. And it's recently, with the public interest in climate change, that I decided to write a book where the change in awareness and willingness to talk about aggressive goals like 0 by 2050 has gone up dramatically, particularly with young people. And so if we can get people to have that as a goal, then we have to have plans where you say, okay, what does the grid look like? The energy has to come from somewhere. You're giving up all coal, all natural gas, all oil. What is the source of that energy? How does it look like? So anyway, I'm doing a book whose goal it is to try and lay out for people what some of the choices are and how you have to cover all the areas of emission and how difficult that will be. So, my book comes out next June.
You've done a very good job hawking it. On this particular thing, is there what is a reasonable goal for net zero? And second question, you talked about what the grid will look like. Can you give us a rough idea what energies you think will fill that space?
Well, there's no doubt that solar and wind, including offshore wind, will be a huge part of that. Because those are intermittent sources, the need either for 24-hour sources like nuclear or unbelievable miracle in terms of both transmission and storage is very, very high. You can look at a country like Japan, Tokyo, 60 gigawatts. You have 7 days where you have no wind or sun power at all. So you have to say to yourself, if you're not going to have people freeze to death, what is the source of energy during that 7-day period? The U.S. Midwest, you have long periods where a cold front sits on it and the wind doesn't blow. So it'll be a lot of renewables and either a storage miracle or quite a bit of nuclear. The electric source will be almost 3 times as big because it'll be taking over parts of transport and industrial and heating that historically went to direct hydrocarbon usage. Anyway, people building models of that future grid, different universities, different people picking their choices, will be the sign that not only do we have a goal to be there by 2050, but we're debating the paths and very concrete plans. When you see things like a 15% diesel tax, create unrest, the willingness to make the type of change and investment in this, you can question whether it's there because the free rider problem has never been worse than it is in climate, particularly for middle-income countries that can appropriately argue that the historical emissions of the rich countries mean they get to wait till per person they've emitted as much as we have.
Do you think a carbon tax is the way to secure that? I mean, you pointed to the political difficulties of that, but surely that's the fairest way to do it.
Yeah, that's a way to do it. If you look at the U.S. in particular, I don't think it's likely to happen. And so, we've had tax credits on renewables. We've had renewable portfolio standards. You can get there in a way that's less neutral. There's a variety of regulations and helping nascent sectors. Certainly what's happened with solar and wind is very good. What's happened in the industrial sector in terms of how do we make steel, how do we make cement, people have sort of gotten excited about the low-hanging fruit. Electric cars, that's the easy part. You still have to do the grid, but the various things, including industrial, are very, very difficult.
You talk, the stuff you've written, you've talked about industrial, but also agricultural as an area that people are not even really beginning to look at in a substantial way, and yet agriculture accounts for almost as much as electricity.
Yeah, cows alone are 6%. There is some hope there, actually, of all my climate-related investments, my investments in Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, may pay for all the battery companies that I've lost money on. So
I think you point out that cows would be the third biggest polluter after China and America.
Yeah, cows, it's both the methane they emit directly, it's the manure usage, then you have fertilizer and land use. And so that sector, what year will Indonesia or Brazil or DRC not have net deforestation? And it doesn't really matter what you do in the temperate zones, because the trade-off of growing trees there, people do the math, it doesn't help. This is a tropical zone game in terms of land use.
Is soil an important part of that?
No, there's a lot of confusion about that. Yeah. Once carbon is out of the geosphere, that is being buried underneath, once it's up in the biosphere, trees die, you have forest fires, you have a 5,000-year half-life residence time of CO2. So as soon as you get things into the biosphere, you can't really say that you've got to get it back into the geosphere in order to make that multi-thousand-year promise that it's not going to be temperature forcing.
Can I push you on nuclear, which I know is your route into it? I mean, what you heard on the previous panel, they were talking about it as well. What do you think is a reasonable expectation for what nuclear power can do? I know you're a believer in it, but...
Well, I put many hundreds of millions into it. And with, it's not a profit-driven activity. The entire nuclear industry is making a product today that is too expensive and whose safety, although it's actually quite good, is too dependent on human operators. And so the nuclear industry will only survive if there's a new generation whose economics and design for inherent safety is dramatically better than anything that's out there today. I don't know for sure that will happen, but when you have 24-hour power that you can place near to the usage of that power, and you're trying to grow the electricity capacity so dramatically, it's a lot easier to see your path to the zero emissions if that's part of your generation portfolio. And nuclear, you get 1 million times as much energy per reaction as you do burning hydrocarbons, and so it's very advantaged if you do the design right. I can't say for sure it would succeed, but it'd be good in this innovation portfolio. We have to have a lot of bets, knowing that some of them won't succeed.
And in that, I think your company, TerraPower, you think you've come up with a new design which would be safer and more efficient.
Yeah, in the computer, our design is amazing. And that's beautiful because you can simulate earthquakes, volcanoes, planes crashing into it, all sorts of things that none of the existing nuclear plants could you do any of that. And you can show that your costs and inherent safety are very, very strong. We need to build a demo plant. At one point, we plan to do that in China. The U.S. government decided that we shouldn't do that. And so now the backup plan now is that we'll try and build that demo plant in the United States. So it's not an easy endeavor, but none of the paths to climate success are risk-free.
We'll come back to US-China in a second, but how frustrating was that for you? You put all this money into setting up this technology. You had the Chinese on board to test it, and the Trump administration stopped.
Well, it's frustrating because I'd gone for a decade meeting with every Secretary of Energy, who had encouraged us, and actually, the U.S. government had created an agreement because you need explicit permission to do this type of collaboration. And so it was a surprise when that was withdrawn, and it meant that a lot of things we had done, it was a setback. In the very best case, it was a 5-year delay. In the worst case, it was a completely collapsed it. I don't care about the money. The question is, does that get added to the portfolio of clean generation? If so, it makes the problem dramatically easier to solve.
Will you be able to try it in America, though? Is there a place?
Oh, we're working. I go and meet with senators and congressmen and say, today's reactors are not economic. Ignore everything else. So the nuclear industry will disappear, and that's true globally, unless there's a new design. The U.S. historically has this capacity to innovate. It understands the sciences and the challenges. It has the historical databases better than any other country. So it'd be great if the U.S. Regulatory and energy R&D budget allowed this next generation to come into place. So that's the current focus, is to get a demo plant built in the U.S.
Do you think there's any sign at all? I mean, just looking out at the audience, you can see people looking somewhat skeptically. Do you think there's any sign at all of nuclear winning people over?
Well, people like cheap electricity. They don't know that much about where it comes from or why it's reliable. They know they like it cheap and reliable. And so when you say to people you're going to double their electricity bill, even when they have a commitment to climate, it's very tough to make these short-term trade-offs. And, the key to the system has been that reliability, which intermittent sources, without a storage miracle, do not provide.
Last thing on that, when you talked about that grid in 2050, how much would you guess that nuclear is of that? Would you expect the share to...
It's bimodal. It'll either be 0% or a third. In the U.S. today, it's 20% of all power generation. In France today, it's 70% of all power generation. In Japan, it was 15% of all power generation. So it'll be pretty modal, somewhat by country, but this new design will either be viewed as acceptable or it won't happen.
A big theme of this conference, as I said, has been China and America. Earlier today, Henry Kissinger said we were in the foothills of a Cold War. As long as I've known you, you have been a passionate advocate of engagement with China. How do you view the current situation?
I'm even more passionate about the value of engagement than ever. The last few years have seen a lot of voices arguing against that, even arguing in some extreme cases for so-called decoupling. I think it's a benefit that there's interdependence. The fact that we have tourists from Japan, we have from China, we have students from China, we have companies that do research in China. Apple is the tech company that actually sells, the only tech company that actually sells a lot of products here in China. That interdependence can lead to more dialogue, more mutual understanding. And so to have people arguing against that is definitely a serious concern.
Do you worry at all about a world with two internets, or do you think the world is too interconnected? I mean, people out here are saying that you could end up with effectively a Chinese internet and an American internet. Is that possible? Or certainly two very different technology systems?
I don't see a way of bifurcating scientific research. So AI, which you publish almost all of the work you do, I don't see a way that you can sort of say, okay, these countries are publishing to each other and these other countries are publishing to each other. Biology, energy, AI, it just doesn't work like that. The idea, the U.S. has thrived intellectually by being at the R&D level a very open country, and that has been to the benefit of the U.S. in terms of things like pharmaceutical companies or software technology companies, and you can't just carry around little notes to each other. Hey, don't give this to somebody whose grandmother was Chinese. It doesn't work.
Surely, though, that is an attitude that is, you may well be saying the correct thing from the point of view of the world economy, from the point of view of efficiency, but there's quite a lot of evidence that some people are prepared to take that on. You wouldn't have trade wars if people were rational.
Well, it'd be interesting to have somebody draw out their bifurcation and try to explain, I'll describe a person to them. I'll describe, Australia, Japan. What side are they saying, which is the open science side? Who's going to go and close all their publishing down and, require that only a small set of people have access to that? AI is very hard to put back in the bottle, and whoever has the open system will so vastly get ahead of whoever tries to not let everybody in the world see what they're doing, that you can completely ignore whoever tries to close their system.
On that subject, what's your estimation of who's ahead in different parts of AI at the moment? Are you one of those people who think that this is an area where China seems to lead the US in some bits?
Even that's kind of a silly thing in my view in terms of what does it mean? I mean, I spent last night 3 hours at the Microsoft Research Lab in Beijing, which is across the street from Tsinghua University. A lot of the best AI work in Microsoft is being done in that lab. They publish papers about the work they do. What is that? Is that Chinese AI? Is that American AI? We gladly pay their salaries. But if we didn't have that publishing approach, those people would go and work somewhere else. And so the world is at a certain state of the art in terms of AI. The companies that fund that in a strong leadership way include Google and Microsoft. But even at universities, they're not far behind whatever the latest commercial funded R&D stuff.
Maybe rephrase it then. Regardless of who's funding it, I accept both American companies. Is there any kind of approximation about which areas you think China is ahead in, which areas you think Europe is ahead in, which areas you think America is ahead in?
Almost every one of those papers is going to have some Chinese names on it and some European names and some American names on it. Even the stuff that comes out of we have a big lab in Cambridge in the UK, and God forbid there's, Asian people in that lab. It's incredible how these people are mixing up and working with each other. Who allowed this to happen?
It'll all stop after Brexit. But in general, in that you have been a great beneficiary of globalization, and you have been a great sponsor of it and a defender of it. Are you worried about it at the moment?
More than I was 5 years ago, yeah. And it's not just the U.S. I mean, the U.K. is very interesting, and the turning inward. Is it cyclical? Because you're always going to have populism come along. The elites, in some ways, will overplay their hand, and you're going to cycle. Or is it secular and it's going to stay that way? I think all of us, come to forums like this seeking insight into, what will turn this around and let very tough problems like climate change be done on a global collaborative basis.
Do you worry the ability of elites at the moment to persuade people that issues like climate change?
It's gone down.
It's gone down.
It's definitely gone down. And whether you want to stop pandemics or solve climate change or stop terrorism, that when you don't get that level of cooperation and trust, that's going to be a huge challenge.
Do you have an explanation for that? I know you read a lot.
No, I'm just I'm not out there asking, yellow vest people why they vote a certain way, or, people in Australia who voted against climate change, or people in, Brazil or Philippines or various places. But it's hard to pick a country where you say, wow, they've got climate change solved. They know how to make steel and cement, and, congratulations. That one's taken care of. I don't know that country.
But it's bizarre, isn't it? Because every government that you visit, that we visit, will say that the green industries are the industries of the future. That's what they want to invest in.
That's great. Did they increase their energy R&D budget? What approach? Who are they investing in to solve these specific problems? At the Paris climate talks, I was involved with the 25 countries committing to doubling energy R&D, which that is really good, because for the long lead time stuff, that's where the solutions are going to come from. Many countries have come through. We have $5 billion of additional energy R&D since the Paris climate talks. And, I am optimistic that we can bring what I call the green premium, that is the extra cost of doing things in a green way. We can bring that premium down very dramatically, which, to say to a middle-income country where India is paradigmatic, hey, you should make your electricity this way, you should make your steel this way, you should fly your planes this way. In order to be able to say that to them, you have to bring the current green premium down by about 90%. But there's many paths to get there. Many scientists who are working ideas that even with the 10% success rate, if we sort of unnaturally accelerate this by creating incentives, regulations, raising R&D budgets, I still believe we can get there.
One last question on that. If you were a government, where would you target that money?
Well, there are, different people do the taxonomy differently. There are things like cheap hydrogen, breakthroughs in transmission where you don't have to do it overhead, or you use superconducting to make it lossless. It's a reasonably finite list. The way I do it in my book, it's 14 things that you want crazy people to think through exactly how they're going to solve those things. And
if it isn't governments, it has to be philanthropists like you?
Well, yes, for the pure R&D part, ideally the governments are going to be bigger. I mean, U.S. DOE budget, which I think should be tripled, is $6 billion a year. So I don't think you're going to get that extra, $12 billion a year out of philanthropy. We did go, I called, 25 people, and I got 21 people to say yes when I called them to invest in this very high-risk venture fund called Breakthrough Energy Ventures. And, we raised $1 billion the first time. We're going to do that many times again so that these high-risk companies, that there's lots of capital. And the great thing that's happened in the last few years is as Breakthrough Energy's technical team has validated these things, we've been able to have other people come in. So far, we haven't had to be the sole investor in any of these companies, even though over half of them, if Breakthrough Energy hadn't been there to help them form the management and explain how the technology works, they would not have come together.
We could carry on talking for a long time, but these gentlemen sadly have to come, and ladies have to go to dinner. I'm going to give... First, can we thank Bill very much? And then I'm going to give you a variety of housekeeping things. Thank you, Bill. The housekeeping is that please note a change to our start time. Tomorrow morning, the plenary will begin at 8:15, not 8:30. And the important information tonight is the Beijing municipality government welcome dinner at the Sunrise Kempinski. Shuttles will be leaving directly from the front of the conference centre, and you have to bring your badge and your red invitation. And 6:15 will be the networking reception, and 7 p.m. is the gala dinner. I originally read it as the Gates dinner, but we will go in that direction. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.